We're here today again with our guest today, Mary Calvi. Mary is one of the anchors, the morning and noon anchor at WCBS TV in New York City. She's also the weekend anchor at Inside Edition. And one of the things she's done is she's written a novel, Dear George, Dear Mary. It's a novel about George Washington and his first love. Mary, thank you for joining us today.
It's such a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for having me.
This book on George Washington is really a very fascinating story. How did you get involved with doing this book?
Well, John, to be honest with you, it's something that I had never expected or anticipated finding. And it was really just coming from a bit of curiosity. You know, as a young girl, I had visited the manor called Philipse Manor. It was a historic home in my town, and everybody has one of those historic homes in their towns, and you just don't know really about the history sometimes. And I had visited as a young girl, and I remembered hearing someone say that, by the way, did you know that the heiress who lived here was once courted by George Washington? And her name was Mary Philipse. And I guess, you know, my name is Mary, her name was Mary, and it just sort of stuck with me for many, many years. And a few years ago, my husband was inaugurated as the mayor of our city of Yonkers, and he decided to have his inauguration at that manor. And for good reason, because it was the original city hall in the 1800s, but it was back in the 1700s that this George Washington story had been around. And, you know, I had asked him, maybe it would be a nice idea to mention that the woman who lived here was once courted by George Washington. And he said to me, that would be a great idea, except like, is it true? Isn't it just local lore? And here I was, a journalist, and I thought, well, maybe I should find out. And that's how it all started.
Now, this is a novel, which most people novel. There is some parts of it that's made up. But how much of this was involved with the serious research into with the history of George Washington and Mary Philipse?
Sure. So the wonderful piece about it was being able to put this puzzle of documents together. And during that time, much of George Washington's writings were saved, including his journal entries, including his financial ledgers. And so I started with those and went very specifically around the time where I believed his courtship began with Mary Philipse. And so I went back to his letters and made a determination as to where he was exactly at those times. So when it comes to George Washington and writings by him, even the dialogue, their actual words that Washington used in his letter writing and his journal entries, there are also there's also a newspaper article that, you know, really blasts George Washington, and it's never really been researched in all these years. And so that article exists, and it's mentioned in the book as well. But as I was putting together these documents and looking at them chronologically, what I found was the story of not just love, but then also deception and then vengeance. And I was quite shocked, honestly, about it. The reason why I did it as a novel rather than something like nonfiction is because Mary's voice was difficult to find exactly. You know, documents involving women were really not preserved at that time. And so much of their stories have gone untold. And the reason why is because not a lot of documentation still exists. Their letter writing doesn't exist. Even, you know, if they had financial ledgers, they don't exist any longer, nor do their diaries in many cases. And that was the case with Mary Philipse. So what I had to do was find anything I could possibly find. I mean, I was looking for scraps, you know, anything I could get my hands on, I was excited about. And so that's why it had to be done in the way it was done in order to be able for her to tell a story of her life.
How important was her relationship with George Washington, not just for him, but also as it plays out in American history? Obviously, she didn't become the first lady. Martha Washington was George Washington's wife. Um, what role did Mary Philipse play in determining what happened with George Washington?
You know, it's such an interesting question that you ask, and it's one that really I had to question myself about many times, because when I was looking at all of these documents and putting this massive puzzle together of documents and historic pieces that kind of have never really been talked about, it was very clear to me that there was a story here that was something bigger than what I had originally ever imagined. And it was that as George Washington was courting Mary Philipse, he was in the British Army, and his British commanders were actually also trying to court Mary Philipse. Reason being, she was the richest single woman in colonial America. So what his commanders were doing was very questionable in my mind. I mean, they were really deceiving him. They were betraying him. They were keeping him away from Mary Philipse. I mean, that's clear as day. They were wronging him. And they even are the ones who I believe are responsible for a newspaper article which attacks him. And I believe they were doing everything they could to make sure Mary didn't marry George Washington because they wanted one of theirs to move in and seize her surrender, as it was called. So I believe it's very clear, and I hope people continue the research to look at this and see if they see what I see. But I believe that as he was he was trying to court Mary Philipse and was courting Mary Philipse. It was his commanders who were really doing him dirty. And it's pretty obvious that when Mary ends up choosing another man, I mean, we do know George didn't marry Mary, he was with Martha, but George Washington quickly turns on his commanders and the British Army itself. He quits the British Army, and there's a hatred that's written about in his own writing about his commanders and the British Army. And so I believe there was this anger that was brewing and really took hold at that very moment when they stole his girl. And, they deceived him, they betrayed him, and there they were taking away Mary Philipse from him. And so I believe that anger stuck around for quite a few years. And, George Washington became general in the American Revolution and took out the Brits. I think the writings of George Washington make it clear that he had reason other than tea in the harbor, for being really opposed to the Brits at that time. I believe they took away his rights, his freedoms, and his choice, really. And so, I think long before tea was tossed in the Boston Harbor, I think there was something more that was brewing, especially with George Washington.
You mentioned Mary Philipse' wealth. The estate, the Philipse property, was pretty extensive, as I understand, here in New York. Ranged pretty much what the entire eastern side of the Hudson, quite a bit up the river.
Yeah, you're right about that, John. It was very expansive. I mean, she owned most of Harlem. Her family owned acres and acres of property. I mean, just miles along the Hudson River. And all of it was taken from them in auctions, and basically the highest bidder took piece by piece. And so they really, and in the end, lost everything. That was an additional twist to the story that I had never had imagined, as to how it was that she was actually named traitor in the American Revolution. And so making a determination as to whether she did something wrong was very eye-opening to me, because in the end, I feel that she was wronged, that she did not turn against America at that time. And so that was a really difficult piece to research, but also was very upsetting, actually, when you learn that 3 women were named traitors in the American Revolution, and only 3 in the American Revolution. I mean, Benedict Arnold wasn't even named an official traitor, as they were. These 3 women, I believe, were the only 3 women who owned significant property in New York at that time. And the reason why I mention New York is because a law was passed only in New York that named them traitors. So this law was only passed in New York. And so Mary was impacted by that.
Her life is pretty interesting, though. Also, you mentioned that you in the novel, in the book, you do go into some of her experiences in life. She had a very close call with death herself as a child.
Yes, that's what I believe happened. And there are tidbits of information about what happened to her family member and how her family member was, found, how the family member was, laid out in the home, and they were pulling twigs from their hair, and the little young boy died on their property after drowning. And so it was, there were pieces of information that were able to be preserved during that time. So yeah, she didn't have it easy, certainly, but not many people did have it easy back then. It was a very difficult time to live in New York, certainly, for a number of people.
I know when you're talking about George Washington, you do go into some of the battles and some of the activities he took part in with the British Army. How do you feel that formed him and led to how this story developed with Mary Philipse?
Oh, it's a really a fascinating question, but also a fascinating area of research, because as George Washington was working with the British Army, he was learning their secrets and their maneuvers, and he was learning exactly how they went into a mission. And in the end, he used that against them in the American Revolution. He knew exactly how they operated. They were very much into strict formations, and they were very much into clearing paths to make sure the horses weren't injured or the wagons were kept together, and things like that. And so it was quite fascinating to be able to see how he acted during the British Army, when he was with the British Army, and how he used all of that he learned to take them out during the American Revolution. And so all of that, I think, really played a part in developing him as a military leader, but also just as a man.
Take us a little bit through the research that you've done. You've looked at quite a bit of documentary evidence, and you also visited a number of places. Take us a little bit about how you proceeded to develop this story.
So one of the uh, really, really challenging parts of this was that, it wasn't like there was this storage room that I could walk into and all of the documents were right there. This was something that took quite a bit of work and in different places. So, for example, the Library of Congress was one place. I also used documentation out of a library out of California. Also, Harvard's Houghton Library was significant in that they had a number of documents that were useful. One of them was really fascinating to see, and it was a letter written by George Washington that really speaks of love. And I guess we could call it a love letter by George Washington, but in it, he talks about, he says, I feel the force of her amiable beauties and the recollection of 1,000 tender passages. I mean, it's quite romantic, and to be able to see it in person was something else. Honestly, it's very well preserved, and the writing is very clear, very neat, and George Washington kept a hold of his letters. I mean, he really, for years and years, he traveled with his letters, thousands of them, from what I understand. And so much of his writing has been preserved after all of these years. So it's really worthwhile taking a look at. When we recorded for the Smithsonian Channel, it's a documentary called George Washington's Secret Love, and it's based on my research. I had the opportunity of also seeing some other documents at George Washington's Mount Vernon that are in the vault, and all of those very well preserved as well. It's really worth taking a look at, especially people who might be interested in the military part of it as well, to see how he changed his style of military maneuvering over the years, but also, to find out that George Washington, while we know him as that face on the dollar bill, or, the carved in marble, he's really a man. And especially when you go back and look at his relationship with Mary, you're looking at George Washington as a young man. And so there's a real authenticity, I think, to his writings at that time that we don't see necessarily as he became a, significant leader.
I know you're talking about Mary Philipse being quite a catch for a man back at that time, but George Washington was considered pretty eligible as someone to get a hold of from a woman's perspective as well, I understand.
Well, most people wouldn't really think of George Washington as a romantic figure, but actually at that time, women found him quite attractive. In fact, they wanted a touch of him, is what was said. He was becoming a rule somebody in the military at that time. So he was a catch. I mean, he was an amazing dancer, and he was a fine horseman. He wrote poetry, and the poetry is included in the novel as well. Who would think George Washington wrote poetry? But at that time, George Washington certainly was a looker, and the catch, as you said, he knew how to dress too. His clothing was all imported, and he only wore the best, really. He knew that in order to become a man of distinction, he had to look the part and act the part. And so he was very careful in how he appeared, but also how he acted. He followed these rules of civility, down to like make sure both feet are on the floor flat as you're sitting. And also other things like, be very wary of how you're walking, make sure you're on the correct side, and make sure, that as you're eating, you take one bite at a time, down to very specific things like that.
I know there are a lot of people who don't necessarily think of our founding fathers as being people. But yet, when you look at whether it be Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, any of those figures, they become far more colorful and intriguing when you start looking at those sort of human traits of them, I would think.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the way history writes them is very different than as they actually were. It's not history's fault, certainly. I mean, because history is looking at it in one way, but there's so many other pieces of it that should be told that have they have failed to tell. And I think it's very important to look at these men as a whole to understand what they did right and what they did very wrong. And so I think that many times the history books don't really look at that. And I think it's very important that we take a full view of them rather than a very specific view of them. It's difficult to talk about any of these people in one paragraph. And so they have very big stories that have really not been told. And so this focuses on Washington as a young man, a few years of his life at that time, and at the very beginning of the American Revolution. And this focuses also of him, when he is even younger, like, as a young teen, and how he was developing as he was trying to become of that man of distinction that he so sought after for so many years. So, but there is so much more of George Washington that I don't get to in this story, and I think others have, and they should. I think it's important to really look at all of the person's life rather than just this very specific part. But it was quite interesting to see him in this stage of life as he is trying to develop, because he had such insecurities at that time, and he didn't become the person he was without this. I mean, he needed this piece in order to become the leader of the country at that time.
I know it's interesting, and one of the episodes that you discussed in that book is that there was at one point when the Revolutionary War was coming through the New York area, and that Washington actually apparently stayed at Mary Phillips's house down in Manhattan.
Yes, that is, from what I understand, truth, according to his journal entries, that he did stay at Mary's sister's townhome, and there would have been enough space for him and those who were traveling with him, I believe, at that time.
And I know she was eventually left the country with her husband. Any indication that in your research that they may have that George Washington may have had some, aid in helping her get out of the country, since you said she was, being facing treason charges?
Mhm. Well, the one thing that was really quite riveting, John, is that a letter was sent to Mary's family mentioning Mary Philipse. And it was at that time, I believe, is when she actually left. So there may have been an indication from him to say, like, it's time, you better get out of here. So I believe so that was the case. However, what I do know for sure is that Mary's properties survived to the American Revolution, and so much of what was here in New York was burned to the ground. However, her homes, their buildings that were in the Hudson Valley all made it through. And I believe that was because of a letter sent from George Washington's camp telling the Brits that they those properties were the heart of neutral ground and they cannot be fired upon or pillaged or rummaged because of that. And in fact, the Brits listened and didn't. They did send a letter back saying, "What are you talking about? We're in the middle of war." But they did honor that request. And so Mary's property survived. So they're some of the very few that made it through the American Revolution that are still standing. I mean, their home in Harlem, the Morris Jumel Mansion, is one of the very few that are still around from that time. And it's quite a beautiful home. They do wonderful programming there and it's still open. In fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote parts of Hamilton there. So there's a lot of history there.
So it sounds a little bit as if George Washington was still a little sweet on Mary Philipse when even though obviously they were going in different directions.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that way. I mean, we do know that he made her home in Harlem his campaign headquarters during the American Revolution, and he stayed there for quite a long time. And I had asked a historian, why did George Washington spend so much time in Harlem? And the historian said, that's a big question. I mean, we've always wondered why he would spend so much time at the Harlem Mansion. And there are indications, I believe, that Mary was staying there by herself. Her husband was not living there at the time. And so it is possible that George Washington and Mary Philipse were living in the same home for about a month and a half, almost at the beginning of the American Revolution.
How do you think, just obviously it's hard to say how someone in history would look back on something like this, but do you think that Washington would have liked people still to know that he was involved with Mary Philipse? Do you think that's something that he would still take pride in?
That's such a good question. It's a difficult one to answer, and because she was named a traitor in the American Revolution. So would he want people to know that his first love became a traitor in the American Revolution? I don't know, but I do think it's a wonderful kind of thing to think about as to whether life would have been different if George Washington had married Mary Philipse, if he did get a chance to ask for her hand in marriage, and if she had said yes, we would have maybe been looking at something very different, because he would have been a New Yorker and would have been married to the richest single woman in colonial America. And would that have changed our fate? I don't know. I mean, but it's something that is quite interesting to think about. And I have done a roundtable just discussing that one possibility. I don't know.
I know that's one of the sort of, shall we say, the dangers of getting into what if history is that you can get into speculations to what might have happened. But it's interesting to think that the whole history of the Revolutionary War may have been different if his relationship with Mary Philipse had been different.
Yeah, because he may not have been general in the American Revolution, and if he wasn't general, would farmers have taken up arms against the Brits? I mean, he was able to motivate and inspire so many to take up arms against the British. And so I'm not sure what would have happened if he was not the general. Yeah.
Certainly, this is a fascinating story. I'm assuming you feel that there's more research that needs to be done to sort of firm up some of the suggestions that you've made in this book.
Well, John, my hope is that others will take this up and really continue the research to make the determination as to what exactly was the turning point for George Washington. I think it's all out there, and I try to bring it up as much as possible, but I'm sure there are more documents out there. There are more articles and letters that would be able to increasingly tell this story. And so that's my hope, is that other people will look at this and decide to take it up as their research as well.
Where do you think that this story should go in, I guess, in sort of the overall view of American history? Is this just a side story, or is this something that you think should be more central to our understanding of the period?
Yeah, well, that's such a good question. And I definitely think the more research that's done, the more informed we will be about exactly how things went. You know, there was this time, there's these omissions and in the letter writing by George Washington that, and whether those letters still exist, I don't know, but there may be more to be found, more to be told. And the more we find and the more we solidify, I think then we would really have an understanding about motivations for getting involved in the American Revolution, at least by George Washington, certainly. So I would hope that we could continue looking at it. And as to your question, I mean, I think that as it is now, I think we're looking at just the start of something much more that can be found, not just involving George Washington, but looking at other leaders as well, and why they decided to go to war. Is there more than we've ever known about so many other uh, you know revolutions? I'm sure there's a lot we can find. That was the interest, that so much history has is there for the finding. And so I think there are a lot of documents that people have never transcribed that should be, and looked at further. And so when they're not transcribed, it's very difficult for us to look at them because we have to go back to the vaults and look at the original documents, and that's very time consuming and very difficult to be able to get into those. And so that's what I'm hopeful that, as digital and physical archives kind of just collide, I think it'll be a lot easier to be able to find stories like this.
Well, thank you much. We're just about out of time. I appreciate you talking to us. As I've been saying, we've been visiting with Mary Calvi. She is the author of this book, Dear George, Dear Mary. It's a story about George Washington and his first love. We'll see you again next time.